Nolan was an incredible person. Um, and his loss has definitely affected our family in ways we could have never imagined. So I just ask that you all please continue praying for us, especially today.
Today is a very hard day for our family.
Okay, baby, okay.
Like I continuously say, every day is a new challenge. But today, knowing the way our son was, the phone calls, through the calls to Dad, I did this today, or this one day, or I don't feel right today. Those are the things that's gonna be missed the most. His voice.
I've been told that one of the people that was with Nolan has been online watching this. If you want to come forward, call us. I'll get you an attorney. I'll pay for your attorney, your choice. We just want the truth. If you have nothing to really be concerned about, then you should step forward. All these parents have said from the beginning is they want the truth. So if you want to join in on what we're seeking, you're welcome. We don't have to slip and slide here. We just want the truth about a young man who we should be celebrating his birthday today.
What happens when a lawyer who once said he was going after people spreading false information suddenly turns his attention toward two of the biggest names discussing the Nolan Wells case? And why were Nancy Grace and Don Lemon reportedly singled out for legal warnings? Those questions are now becoming part of an already complicated story surrounding Nolan Wells, a case that has generated intense debate, competing accounts, and a steady stream of commentary online. And according to the material discussed in the source video, this latest development involves a series of 7 letters sent to Nancy Grace, followed by another letter directed toward Don Lemon. And before we get into all of that, welcome to the channel. If you're new here, take a moment to subscribe so you can stay with us as this story develops. I also want you to watch this short video because it adds important context to what we're about to discuss. Take a look, and then we'll come right back to the latest development involving Nancy Grace and Don Lemon.
As an altercation witness emerged, a witness that claims she saw an altercation at Horn Island. If this is true, if there is a witness who has a husband with her on the boat and they took a certain amount of video, it could change everything. Can we talk about a potential witness to an altercation? And she seems to suggest it was over Katie. Why? Don't know what the altercation was. Maybe it was, hey, leave her alone and get on the boat, or leave her alone, she's my girlfriend, or it could be anything. That is significant. It could prove or disprove your friend's timeline.
Well, Nancy, I think that it's a big obstacle to climb here because I've never heard of this altercation whatsoever.
But before we decide what those letters mean, there is something important to understand. A legal threat is not the same thing as a lawsuit, and a lawsuit is not the same thing as a finding that someone actually defamed another person. Those distinctions matter, especially when the underlying case is still being discussed publicly, and some claims remain disputed. The person at the center of this particular confrontation is described in the source as the lawyer representing 3 young men connected to the Nolan Wells controversy. The source identifies him as Eddie and says he is a former lawyer for Donald Trump. The material also says Tyler Cox is associated with the defense. The first striking detail is the number of letters. 7 letters were reportedly sent to Nancy Grace through Twitter. The source narrator says the letters challenged the way Nancy Grace was discussing what is referred to as the STO call and disputed the timeline surrounding July 4. One of the letters reportedly argued that at approximately 4:30 p.m. Central Time on July 4, there were 24 occupants across 2 boats. That is a very specific claim. And when a case depends heavily on timing, specific times can become extremely important. Imagine looking at a clock and seeing 4:30 in the afternoon. Now imagine trying to reconstruct where several people were at that exact moment, which boat they were on, who was present, what happened before and after, and how that information was established. A difference of even a relatively short amount of time can matter when investigators are trying to build a reliable timeline. That is why these letters attracted attention. The source shows the first letter and then goes through additional correspondence. Some of the language in the letters was described as confrontational. One letter reportedly told Nancy Grace to stop asking what the sender characterized as clown questions. Another challenged her discussion of the case and questioned her approach to interviewing people connected with the investigation. The source narrator chose not to read every word of every letter, but the important point is that there was repeated contact. Then came letter number 7. And this time, according to the source, the message was directed toward Don Lemon. The letter reportedly accused Don Lemon of repeatedly criticizing Warren, Jax, and Morgan while asking why they had not been invited to speak with him. The message also argued that the people being discussed were innocent and suggested that the truth was on their side. Now, that creates a very different question. Why send so many letters to Nancy Grace and then contact Don Lemon as well? The source narrator has one interpretation, suggesting that the choice may have something to do with the public profiles and financial resources of the people being contacted. But that is an interpretation, not an established fact. The letters themselves do not, by themselves, prove what the sender's ultimate motive was. And that distinction is worth keeping in mind as we continue. There is also an important history behind the legal threats being discussed. According to the source material, the lawyer had previously indicated that action could be taken against TikTok users, Instagram users, YouTubers, or other people who allegedly spread false information about the 3 young men. The source then describes an earlier situation involving an Instagram user who reportedly received a legal warning and responded publicly, essentially saying that she had very little money and was prepared to defend herself. Whether that earlier dispute ultimately became a formal lawsuit is not established by the material we have here. The source narrator says that the matter appeared to go quiet afterward. But now Nancy Grace and Don Lemon are in the conversation. And that is significant because both are highly visible media personalities with large audiences of their own. Still, there is another reason this story deserves careful attention. The legal correspondence did not arrive in isolation. It appeared while other disputed information about Nolan Wells was circulating online, including alleged text messages, questions about metadata, conflicting accounts about an alleged altercation, and claims concerning what may or may not eventually appear in toxicology results. Those issues are separate, but they all contribute to the same larger problem. There is a tremendous amount of information circulating, and not all of it has been independently verified. For example, the source discusses alleged text messages between Warren and Christine. The narrator itself warns viewers not to assume those messages are authentic simply because screenshots exist. Questions were raised about whether messages could have been deleted and whether metadata had been provided to establish their authenticity. That is an important caution. A screenshot can show what someone wants the public to see. It does not automatically establish the complete conversation, the original device, the date, or whether anything was removed. And that brings us back to the confrontation with Nancy Grace and Don Lemon. The letters challenge how the Nolan Wells story is being presented publicly. But the existence of those letters does not settle the underlying questions about Nolan's death, nor does it establish that every claim made by either side is correct. What it does show is that the public discussion has reached a point where lawyers and media personalities are now directly confronting one another over how the case is being portrayed. And there is another detail from the source that makes this even more complicated. The same former officer whose statements were being challenged by the narrator had appeared on Nancy Grace's program, where questions were raised about the timeline, an alleged witness, and whether certain evidence had actually been authenticated. That is where the story moves from a series of legal letters into a much larger dispute over evidence. Because if two sides are presenting different versions of what happened, the most important question is not who speaks the loudest, it is what can actually be verified. And in the next part, we need to look much more closely at the disputed timeline, the alleged witness to an altercation, and the metadata questions that have become part of this growing Nolan Wells controversy. The legal letters may have grabbed everyone's attention, but the deeper issue is what those letters were challenging. Behind the arguments over Nancy Grace and Don Lemon was a much bigger disagreement about the timeline surrounding Nolan Wells, what certain people claim they saw, and whether some of the information being circulated can actually be verified. One of the most important examples involves a photograph or video that has been discussed repeatedly. The source material says questions were raised about when that image or video was actually taken. The key piece of evidence being requested was metadata, the information attached to a digital file that can sometimes help establish when and where a photograph or video was created. That sounds technical, but the basic question is simple. When was the image actually recorded? According to the source, the former officer discussing the material had previously indicated that he would try to obtain the metadata from the people who provided the footage. During an appearance with Nancy Grace, however, he reportedly acknowledged that he did not have the exact timestamp available and would need to ask for it. That distinction matters. There is a major difference between saying, "This is what the evidence shows," and saying, "This is what we believe happened, but we are still waiting for the original information that could confirm it." The source narrator highlighted that difference repeatedly. The dispute becomes even more interesting when we look at the alleged altercation on Horn Island. According to the material discussed in the source, Nancy Grace raised the possibility of a woman who claimed that she and her husband had witnessed an argument involving Nolan. The woman reportedly indicated that her husband had recorded video and that she was prepared to contact police if someone did not come forward. But there was an immediate problem. The identity of the woman had not been independently established in the source material, and the alleged video had not been authenticated. That means the claim could be important if verified, but it should not automatically be treated as established evidence. Nancy Grace reportedly asked the former officer about this potential witness during an interview. His response, according to the source, was that he had never heard of the alleged altercation. And that is where the narrator saw a contradiction. Because the same source material points to an earlier discussion on the former officer's own platform in which the subject of an alleged altercation had apparently already been raised. If that account is accurate, then there is a straightforward question that needs answering. How could someone discuss an alleged altercation previously and later say they had never heard of it? There could be explanations. Perhaps the earlier information referred to a different account. Perhaps the details had changed. Perhaps the information was too unverified to be treated as a genuine witness account. The source narrator, however, interpreted the difference as evidence that the former officer was contradicting himself. For viewers trying to understand the case, the safest approach is to separate the two things. There is the existence of a claim about an altercation, and there is the question of whether the claim has been independently verified. Those are not the same thing. The same principle applies to the alleged text messages discussed earlier. The source showed what it described as alleged messages between Warren and Christine. But again, the narrator raised questions about authenticity, missing messages, and metadata. That caution is important because screenshots can be incomplete. A person can provide a portion of a conversation without necessarily providing everything that came before or after it. Without the original records or independent verification, viewers may not know whether the screenshot represents the complete exchange. The source narrator therefore urged viewers not to treat the alleged messages as definitive proof, and there was another claim circulating at the same time. The former officer reportedly said he had been told by someone that Nolan was using cocaine around July 4, and expressed extreme confidence that the toxicology results would eventually show cocaine in Nolan's system. According to the source, the statement went beyond ordinary uncertainty. The speaker reportedly described himself as being 150% certain. But the source then presented another statement that appeared to point in the opposite direction. Nancy Grace reportedly said that the autopsy had been completed and that there were reports that no cocaine was found in Nolan's system, while also emphasizing that those reports were not corroborated publicly. That leaves viewers with an unresolved conflict. One person claimed extraordinary certainty about what the toxicology report would contain. Another reported information suggesting the opposite, and neither statement, based on the material available here, should be treated as the final answer unless the official toxicology findings are publicly confirmed. This is exactly why the distinction between evidence and speculation becomes so important in a case like this. A person can receive information privately. A commentator can repeat what a source told them. A television host can report what someone else claims. But none of those steps automatically transforms an allegation into established fact. The source then raised another question involving the Mississippi District Attorney. If certain details about the autopsy or toxicology were supposedly sealed or unavailable to the public, how were some media personalities reportedly discussing them? That is a legitimate question to ask, but it is still only a question. The available material does not establish that confidential records were improperly released, nor does it establish exactly how any reported information reached the people discussing it. This is where the Nolan Wells story becomes particularly difficult to follow. There are lawyers sending letters. There are commentators challenging one another. There are alleged screenshots. There are questions about metadata. There are claims about witnesses. There are competing statements about the timeline. And there are reports about evidence that has not necessarily been made public in full. For an older viewer sitting at home watching this unfold, it can be tempting to decide that one side must be telling the truth and the other side must be lying. But the available information does not justify making every one of those conclusions. Some questions remain genuinely unanswered. And perhaps the most important question is this: what happens when the original evidence becomes available? Because if the metadata is eventually produced, it could help establish when a piece of footage was recorded. If an alleged witness is identified and interviewed by investigators, that could clarify whether the reported altercation actually occurred. If the original messages are authenticated, they could provide more context than the screenshots currently circulating. And if official toxicology findings are released, they could settle at least some of the speculation surrounding Nolan's condition before his death. Until then, the public is left with fragments. And fragments can tell us where to look, but they do not always tell us the entire story. There is also a human side to all of this that should not be forgotten. While lawyers, commentators, and online personalities continue debating evidence, Nolan's family has been publicly mourning him. The source material includes a deeply emotional birthday message from Christine, written for Nolan on what would have been his 19th birthday. That message shifts the tone of the story completely. After all the arguments over letters, interviews, screenshots, and competing claims, there is still a family trying to understand what happened to their son. And that is where the story takes its most emotional turn. Because Nolan's birthday was not simply another day in the investigation. It became a day when his parents publicly remembered the young man they lost while continuing to ask the same basic question: what happened to Nolan Wells? And that question is where we need to go next. While the arguments over lawyers, interviews, screenshots, and disputed evidence continued, Nolan Wells's family was facing something much more personal. The day that would have marked Nolan's 19th birthday arrived, and instead of celebrating his life with him, his parents and loved ones were left remembering a son who was no longer there. Christine wrote a message to Nolan that was later shared publicly. She described him as an amazing young man and spoke about the joy, laughter, and happiness he had brought to the family. She remembered him as a son, brother, godson, grandson, nephew, and friend. And then came the words that made the message especially painful. She reminded people that although Nolan was no longer physically with the family, his memory and the legacy he left behind would remain. For a family going through grief, a birthday can bring everything back into focus. The date on the calendar remains the same, but the person who should be there is missing. Christine's message also included a simple request for people to keep negative comments away from Nolan's family. She was grieving, but she was also trying to protect the people closest to her. That became an important part of the story, because while the public conversation had become increasingly heated, Nolan's family was trying to keep attention on the young man they loved and on the question they had continued asking: what happened to their son? Around the same time, the source material describes a prayer visual and a prayer rally held in Nolan's memory. During one of those moments, Nolan's father, Elmore, spoke about the difficulty of facing each day without his son. He described the things the family would miss most, including Nolan's voice and the ordinary phone calls that once seemed so normal. Those details are easy to overlook when a case becomes dominated by arguments online. But they matter, because behind every disputed timeline and every legal warning is a family that has to live with the consequences of whatever happened. At the prayer gathering, the central message was simple. The family wanted the truth and did not want to be distracted. That statement is especially relevant now because the public discussion surrounding Nolan's case has become crowded with competing narratives. There are people who believe the three young men connected to the controversy have been unfairly accused. There are others who believe important questions about Nolan's final hours have not been answered. There are commentators who have examined the timeline. There are lawyers challenging what they believe are misleading statements. And there are members of the public trying to determine which pieces of information can actually be trusted. That is why the reported letters to Nancy Grace and Don Lemon matter, even though the letters themselves do not resolve the case. They show just how contentious the public discussion has become. The source material describes the lawyer sending 7 letters to Nancy Grace and another message to Don Lemon. The letters reportedly challenged their coverage and defended the young men involved. But again, there is an important distinction. A letter threatening or warning of legal action is not itself a court ruling. It does not establish that defamation occurred. It does not establish that Nancy Grace or Don Lemon will actually be sued. And it certainly does not establish who is right about what happened to Nolan. Those questions would require evidence and, if a case were actually filed, a legal process. For now, the most responsible way to describe the situation is that legal action has been discussed or threatened, while the material available to us does not establish that a court has ruled on the underlying accusations. That distinction may sound simple, but it becomes extremely important when a case is being followed by thousands of people online. One dramatic headline can make a legal warning sound like an actual lawsuit. A screenshot can make an allegation look like a proven fact. A confident statement can make an unverified claim sound certain. And once those claims are repeated enough times, people can forget where they originally came from. The Nolan Wells case has demonstrated exactly how quickly that can happen. The source material itself repeatedly warns viewers about unverified information, particularly concerning alleged messages, alleged witnesses, metadata, and toxicology. That caution should remain at the center of the discussion, because there is still a difference between what people say happened and what investigators can prove happened. There is also another detail from the source that deserves attention. The 3 young men connected to the controversy were reportedly present during a prayer visual involving Nolan's family. The source says this was reported by TMZ and interpreted that appearance in a particular way. But again, interpretation is not proof of motive. We can establish that the source says they were reported to have joined the call. We cannot establish from that alone why they joined it. That is another example of why separating facts from interpretation matters. The same principle applies to the dispute with Nancy Grace and Don Lemon. We know the source describes letters challenging their coverage. We know those letters reportedly defended the young men. We know the correspondence raised accusations about how the case was being discussed. But we do not know, from this material alone, whether those warnings will ultimately become a formal lawsuit, or whether any court will determine that defamation occurred. That remains unresolved. And perhaps that is the most important point to leave viewers with. The public wants answers. Nolan's family wants answers. Commentators want answers. Lawyers are presenting their side. People connected to the case are defending themselves. But the strongest answer will not necessarily come from the person with the loudest platform. It will come from evidence that can withstand scrutiny. That means original records, authenticated footage, verified timelines, reliable witness accounts, official findings, and, where appropriate, information presented through the legal system. Until those pieces are available, viewers should be careful about turning allegations into conclusions. The Nolan Wells story is still surrounded by questions, and the confrontation involving Nancy Grace and Don Lemon has added another layer to that ongoing dispute. But the legal warnings are not the end of the story. They may actually be the beginning of a new phase in the public battle over how Nolan's case is discussed. If a formal lawsuit is filed, the allegations would become part of a legal process. If no lawsuit follows, the letters may remain part of the public dispute without ever reaching a courtroom. For now, that outcome remains unknown. And that leaves us with one final question. When you look at everything surrounding this controversy, the disputed timeline, the alleged messages, the questions about metadata, the reported witness, the conflicting statements, and now the legal confrontation involving Nancy Grace and Don Lemon, which part do you believe deserves the closest scrutiny? More importantly, do you think the public conversation is bringing people closer to the truth, or is the sheer volume of competing claims making the truth harder to see? Let me know what you think in the comments. And if you want to continue following developments in the Nolan Wells case, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you do not miss the next update.